Back on the conversation. The Cuomo era is finally over in New York, thank God. Now we're presumably get some new leaders, but are they going to be the same as the old leaders, or are we going to actually get something different in what is supposed to be a liberal or progressive state? Well, we're going to bring on Cenk Lahut, talk about. He's a politics reporter, insider, covers New York politics. Jake, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
No problem. So, Jake, you've written about new exciting leaders in New York that are a little bit different than the old guard. Obviously, AOC jumps to mind. But really the question is that relevant at all? Or are the politicians just going to go back to doing what they always do in New York, which is basically be corrupt and give everything to their donors? And if I'm being honest about it, and that's what I do, and have the media cheerlead for it.
Yeah, well, clearly that's in the legacy of Tammany Hall and really what New York politics has been for the 20th century and most of this century. What I would say to counter that is, one, if you look at around 2016, 2018, this is when Governor Cuomo actually started to lose quite a bit of leverage in terms of his relationship with the legislature. Principally, there were all these newer progressive members who were coming in. The ones I would name right off the bat are people like State Senator Alessandra Biaggi. You have Assembly Member Yulee New from the Financial District in Chinatown in the lower chamber. Members like this who were kind of the, maybe not necessarily in the Democratic Socialists, but in this newer generation of a true left coming from New York City. They come through the ranks, and crucially what a number of other Democrats did in that cycle was oust these Democratic members of the Independent Democratic Caucus, or you'll hear the term IDC thrown around a lot. Basically what that was that they were caucusing with Republicans and effectively giving the Republicans a majority in the Senate, even though it was a Democratic majority in the state Senate on paper. So basically what that does for Governor Cuomo is he no longer has this trump card of always being able to come in as the deal maker and the person who will solve the gridlock between the Democratic majority assembly, which again is proportional representation, mostly members from New York City, Long Island, downstate. And then you have the state Senate, which is similar to the US Senate, accounts for rural areas in a kind of weight on the scales manner. So you have upstate and usually Republicans having a heavier influence there. So that dynamic is over for now. And you have a really deep bench of a lot of Democrats, particularly in New York City, but also in other corners of the state, who no longer have to kind of wait their turn for the governor's preferred pecking order. And I think a lot of these primaries, including the 2022 governor's race, are going to be wide open.
Yeah, we'll see about that. And so the reason why I'm skeptical, Jake, your facts are all right, no question. And Cynthia Nixon lost against Cuomo, obviously, but I think it's fair to say that she had some influence in wiping out those conservative Democrats, because most of them lost in that same race. And so that was a pivotal race that progressives won, even though the top of the ticket lost. So all of that is correct, no question about it, and it's important context. Now, having said that, look, I keep going back to the press because I think they're the main problem. Because now everybody knows that Cuomo backed that group of conservative Democrats. Everybody knows that he basically put them Republicans secretly back in charge, and everybody knows why he did it, which was his donors. His donors wanted the Republicans to win, so he handed the state back to them. Now, everybody in the press knows that. They write about that group, but they never ever connect the dots and never told the voters of New York, oh, by the way, your governor is incredibly corrupt and he does everything on behalf of his donors.
Well, I mean, I think you're making a good point. Well, I think if you're someone who reads the coverage in the Albany Times-Union, or you read outlets that have a member in the Legislative Correspondence Association in the Capitol, they were saying these things for years. But part of this is a structural business of journalism issue, in the sense that the number of reporters in the Capitol bureau is so diminished from what it used to be. And really, the New York State Capitol is kind of an exception in the modern era, where there are still a number of beat reporters for local, regional, and national papers who are based there. But that's just not the case in a lot of other state capitals. So I think that part of the issue is, in our media ecosystem, we're not seeing reporters who have been saying these things forever. Someone like Jimmy Vielkind of the Wall Street Journal, a great example. He's been covering Cuomo for the Times-Union, for Politico, now for the Wall Street Journal, and he has made really kind of whether it's in a press conference going toe-to-toe with Cuomo, or just plain spoken reporting. He has a great kind of perch in his coverage now. But you can name a bunch of other people who I think have really done an exceptional job holding Cuomo accountable, holding his feet to the fire. And through all these ethical issues that he's had in his administration, they've been reported on. The question is, how much does it seem to factor into primaries? How much does it factor into Democratic voters and in the public writ large? So I just think we're not hearing the same level of amplification from the folks who are seeing this, very clearly up close, but in our increasingly, nationalized and hyper partisan, discourse just in all social media, on, whether it's getting eyes on cable, eyes on streaming. Those aren't the kind of things that tend to rise to the surface.
Yeah, so Jake, that's a great point. And there are some wonderful reporters at the local level that actually do the hard work of reporting. And those are exactly the kind of folks we want to support. But when you get to the bigger players, and look, local news is hopeless. And unfortunately, a huge number of people still get their news from local news, local television news, right? And television is just, they're never gonna hold politicians accountable. They're just ass kissers by nature. It's inconceivable that they would hold them accountable. So no hope in local television news, including the biggest local TV news outlets in New York, right? So I'm not even having that conversation. And unfortunately, they influence a lot of people. But when you get to people who should know better, New York Times and cable news, in a sense, they're all Cuomo-sexuals, to use that term that was used before.
So they're not gonna retire that quite yet, huh?
No, and so New York Times, from time to time, does a really good story, investigative story, like on the Moreland Commission. And so how do I know how deeply corrupt Andrew Cuomo is? Partly because of that New York Times story, right? And they explained how it connects back to his real estate donors. The minute you touch the real estate donors, he shuts down the commission, okay? But then they have collective amnesia and instantly forget about it and go back to reporting Cuomo incredibly positively, as if their own investigative reporting team didn't break the story that the guy is as corrupt as any politician in America.
Yeah, and the whole weird period from the start of the pandemic to, I guess you'd really say, like this past winter, where it was just the simple juxtaposition of Cuomo filling this void, really I think an emotional need people had during the pandemic. And we've been over what he did well in the briefings and stuff before. But I think that did, to your point, overshadow and kind of almost overcompensate for what were a lot of the same attributes at play. I mean, I think the things that made Cuomo come across in the way that struck a nerve with at least a decent portion of voters on the center and kind of your moderate Democrats during that period was he kind of micromanages. He likes to really go on at length about almost anything, personal stories, random tangents. But also his kind of domineering manner of overriding, local officials and trying to have a decisive, XYZ response to the pandemic, no questions asked. Those are the same things that got him in all this trouble in the first place. I mean, he really did kind of live and die by the sword in terms of always being in everybody's business and always having this, menacing management / leadership style. So, I mean, to the media criticism point, I think a lot of this is very much fair game. And I think that also it should be taken seriously because, frankly, because New York's on the East Coast, because so many media companies are based here, yeah, it has an outsized influence on the way we talk about national politics and certainly the way we talk about Democrats. So I think all that's fair game, but ultimately, I think the credit does go to the people who have been on this from day one. And at this point, I think that there is really a wide open whether it's the 2022 governor's race or just kind of a general power dynamic within the New York State Democratic Party, that I'm not sure if Kathy Hochul is like guaranteed to be the next governor for a full term.
Jake, hear me now, quote me later. Okay, maybe literally in your case, in a story. All of the media will fall in line for the next corporate Democrat. They'll not be, unless it's AOC, and that's a different level of star power, right? And I hope she doesn't do that. I think that would be a waste of her talent. But if it's just a progressive that's up and coming versus a corporate Democrat, all of the press will paint the corporate Democrat as the legitimate heir and the credible candidate, and they will paint the progressive as a radical, an outsider, an upstart. All these words that trigger for their readers. Remember, don't vote for them. They're not legitimate, right? So,
well, I mean, I think it's yes, right.
No, go ahead, Jake.
I mean, I just think it depends on where in the media ecosystem you're looking. Like the New York City tabloid coverage, I think that the more competitive a race is, the better it is for them. But yeah, obviously, like places like the New York Post are, would tend to describe a candidate a certain way versus the New York Daily News or whatever. What I think is the more important thing going on is there's kind of a generational changing of the guard happening in New York, where one, Kathy Hochul is not really part of the Cuomo club per se. Now, that is definitely going to be just her simple association with him will be an issue in the 2022 primary. But she really has more of a base of support in Western New York. And her whole point of being on the ticket in the first place in 2014 was to offer kind of an upstate balance to what was at that point Cuomo trying to go through with a number of controversial bills. Obviously, the gun control one was up there, but really Hochul is yes going to enjoy the incumbency advantages. But I've heard a lot of, and let's just get to the chatter. I've heard most rumors about Jumaane Williams, who's the newly elected New York City public advocate, potentially doing a run. A little bit about Attorney General Tish James, but I mean, I think that that's a crazy position for her to be in. And it was the Cuomo team really who was pushing the whole idea that this investigation was politically motivated and there would be a Tish James primary challenge to Cuomo in 2022. But looking down the line, someone like AOC, I think that she has such influence in our politics and culture that it doesn't really matter what her office is necessarily, because her reach is kind of well beyond the conventions of any bully pulpit from before. But you also have people like Antonio Delgado, who's a congressman in the Hudson Valley, first black person to ever flip that district, ever hold it, and he flipped it from Republicans who had been controlling it for the period up until the midterms. Before that, that was Kirsten Gillibrand's seat. So, even figures who like the primary opponents of Delgado in that race did call him a corporate Democrat. I think that it's just so up in the air right now that even the typical lanes we've seen of, the moderate money supported candidates in a Democratic primary like that dynamic might change now that we have a number of people who are ready to move up a position, basically. And that's just the dynamic of it being a one-party state where, there's never gonna be a changing of the guard party-wise in the legislature or anything like that. So it's when there's a huge figure going out like Cuomo that people who've been waiting a while can suddenly move up and get their turn. Or more importantly, people who've been banging at the door more recently can, really get in the center of the conversation by having a position with actual serious power and influence.
Yeah, and by the way, the two names that haven't been mentioned, but they're probably not interested in it, but Jamal Bowman, Mondaire Jones, interesting new congressman from New York, both very strong and very popular. So also interesting to note. All right, Jake Lahut from Insider covering this intelligently. We appreciate it. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, and I'll see if I can quote you on that later, Jake.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR, so those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.